People don't want to talk about this as much, although lately, I think because of events in the news, there's more and more discussion about national security and its link to prosperity. And so what I wanted to do for a few moments is speak to you before a question and answer about both my interests in public and foreign affairs and where we are as a nation heading into the 21st century, as we are in now the early stages of the 21st century, and what it means. Let me start by a proposition that perhaps those of you, so many students that are here and others who study both history and international politics, I think would agree with. And that is that if you look at the course of human history, thousands of years of recorded history, what we know to be the affairs of man, security and prosperity have not been the natural order of things. In fact, the story of humanity has been the story of conflict, often armed and bloody and disruptive. In just the last century, twice, this nation and the world were thrown into deep global conflicts in World War I and World War II. And, of course, we lived through the Cold War and Korea, Vietnam, and some other engagements. But an interesting thing happened after the end of World War II. America emerged unquestionably as the most powerful nation on the earth, and it used that power and that influence to set up guidelines for international conduct. From the lessons learned in World War II, we tried to put in place, along with freedom-loving people everywhere, norms for international relationships between nations and people, in the hopes of never again having a conflict like the Second World War or the First World War before it. And the results were unquestionably positive. It wasn't an era without any sort of conflict. Certainly we lived through a Cold War in which the Soviet Union and the United States came close on a couple of occasions to catastrophe. But by and large, it was an era of extraordinary spread of democracy and freedom, and more importantly, of prosperity all over the world. In fact, if we look back now at the end of World War II to where we stand today, two of the most prosperous nations on earth were the nations that lost that war, in Germany and in Japan. Nations like South Korea that emerged divided during the Cold War were not so long ago were recipient states of aid and now have become donor states. In essence, the story of the 20th century, though not perfect, is the story of prosperity, of the spread of democracy and stability around the world. All of it the result of American leadership. Not America by itself. We certainly had participants who worked alongside us to make this possible. But since the end of the Second World War, America has been the only nation with both the economy and the military power, and therefore the international heft, to pull together this international order and to help maintain it as the leader of the free world and a free people throughout. It wasn't a period without challenge, and on a number of occasions, we certainly had to examine ourselves and what we wanted to stand for in order to ensure that we confronted the challenges of our time. But as we look back at that era, it is unquestionably an American century, not just because of the example we set here at home, but because of the difference our leadership made around the world. So my point is that especially since the beginning of that era, but especially from the period that ended the Cold War until perhaps the attacks of 9/11, the world we knew was largely a peaceful and prosperous one. Certainly there were conflicts and humanitarian crisis and horrible crimes committed against humanity in parts of the world, but by and large the world was able to avoid wide-scale conflict. And it was an era where the multipolar world ended, and in fact the United States stood unquestionably once again as the only superpower on the globe. But beginning on that September day in 2001, the world began to change, and I argue, began to go back to a sort of normal state of affairs if you look at it from the aspect of human history. And now as we enter this second decade of the 21st century, that pace towards that trend has only accelerated. Now I'm going to describe to you the world as we wish it were. A world where every country and every leader on the world was committed to peace, where we respected one another, where nations that had disagreements could negotiate them at international forums and work their way through, where all disputes could be resolved by talking rather than by conflict, where every nation was committed to the freedom and the dignity of all human beings. This is the world we wish it were. This is the world as we wish it were. This is the goal. This is the world that we aspire to one day see. But still, it is not the world as it is. And every single day we are reminded of that now across the planet. The world as it is a world where in China, a government systematically violates the rights of its own people, the human rights of their own people, but in addition has now expanded its territorial claims in the region. It claims that islands and rock formations and other territories in the region rightfully belong to them. And they cite historical evidence from thousands of years ago to back up their claim. But they're not just saying these words anymore. These claims have always been there. They've now increased their military capacity significantly, to the point where they are on pace to become a dominant military power in the region and perhaps begin to act on some of these claims. The fear is that at some point, the price of confronting China in any sort of conflict in the region will be so high that the countries of the region will recognize the United States will be unwilling or incapable of standing up to the security guarantees that we've made to our partners and allies in the region. And as a result, these nations will be forced to accept new terms, in terms of not just territorial integrity, but their own sovereignty and their relationship to China and the world. We look to Europe, where at some point in the last few years, Vladimir Putin has made a decision that his relationship with America and the West is a zero-sum game, where either he wins or we do. He has walked away from the idea that somehow we can both benefit. And despite our frequent urgings by multiple presidents and America at large, he has discarded that view and has made up his mind that the only way he can succeed and restore Russia to the great power status he wants it to be is if somehow we are diminished and the West is diminished. You see him acting on this belief. In Eastern Europe, he has seen it as necessary to invade Crimea and potentially right now Ukraine. In fact, not potentially, in fact. They are now involved in a similar operation to what you saw in Crimea, as Russian agents cross the border to agitate, to provoke, in the hopes of creating the stage for then a military intervention and to delegitimize the government in Kiev. Beyond it, you saw that just a few years ago, he took the exact same action in a much more overt way in Georgia. And multiple nations in Eastern Europe now feel threatened by Russian expansionism, by the rhetoric that's coming from Moscow. Which, by the way, internally in Russia, we've seen nationalism and outrageous speech that we didn't see even in the Soviet era begin to grow. It is a daunting precedent. You move further south into the Middle East and you find extraordinary challenges there as well. The Syrian conflict has become a proxy war between Iran, Russia, and Assad on the one side and everybody else on the other. And tragically, in addition to that, vast ungoverned spaces have opened up in Syria where the government doesn't control the territory. And it increasingly has become the premier operational space on the planet for radical jihadists to train and operate from. I will make a prediction to you tonight that if things continue the way they are, soon we will see attacks staged against our interests and, God forbid, perhaps even our homeland from those ungoverned spaces in Syria. Beyond that, we see Iran's nuclear ambitions destabilizing the region as well. As Iran aspires towards a nuclear weapon, other nations are prepared to take steps to match them. And I am convinced that a nuclear Iran will quickly be followed by a nuclear Saudi Arabia, and one day potentially a nuclear Turkey as well. Our strongest alliances in the region feel threatened. The Jordanians, extraordinary partners in safety and security, feel threatened every single day. Not just by 1 million and more refugees that have across the border and placed tremendous strains on their budget, but by the existence of radicals just north of their border that threaten to come into Jordan and one day overthrow that government. And of course, Israel is insecure as they've been in a very long time. Everywhere they look, they see insecurity. Syria is insecure. Egypt is going through extraordinary transition. Their relationships with the Turks have significantly degraded. And oftentimes from Washington, they feel like some of the rhetoric creates space between us and them that invites even more aggression on the part of their enemies, not to mention an international effort to delegitimize Israel's right to exist. In Latin America, an area that often gets neglected, not by me because I live so close to it, and not by you because you care about our region, but by many policymakers, there is troubling trends as well. Cuba has long been a dictatorship, but now throughout Latin America, we are seeing the spread of totalitarianism disguised as democracy. You see, simply having an election alone does not make you a democracy. You have to govern as democrats. You have to have freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. You have to have free and fair elections. And in nation after nation, this is eroding. It's already eroded in Nicaragua and in Venezuela, in Ecuador and in Bolivia. It threatens now to erode in places like Panama and Argentina. And these hard-fought gains in democracy and in progress in the region now seem like perhaps they're beginning to slip away. There are other parts of the world that I could point to as sources of conflict. But the bottom line is that all over the world, we are beginning to see the reemergence of a battle, an ideological, a spiritual battle between the forces of tyranny and the forces of freedom. This is perhaps simplistic language to some, but it is truly what it is. For I ask you, what democracy on the planet is creating conflict with their neighbors? Every single flashpoint on Earth, every single conflict on this planet, and every place where people are suffering and dying and being invaded and imprisoned and persecuted, it is a tyranny that stands behind that action. In Asia, it is China and North Korea that create instability. In Europe, it is Russia. In the Middle East, it is the Iranians and radical jihadists. In Latin America, it's the Castros and Chavez and now Maduro and Ortega in Nicaragua. It isn't Switzerland. It isn't Ireland or the United Kingdom. It isn't the freedom-loving people of the world. It's the tyrannical governments that are setting the stage for this. And so what is the choice before us? Well, there seems to be two schools of thought. One school of thought in American politics, shared by some on both the left and right, is that what we need to do now is further disengage. The time has come for America to take a step back from the global stage and allow our allies and other nations on the planet to take a greater role. And I would say to you that ideally that would be fantastic. I would love to see NATO reinvigorated with the NATO governments of Europe spending more money in their national defense. I would love to see the democracies of Latin America rally to the cause of freedom and democracy in other nations. In an ideal world, this is exactly what would happen. But as I told you a moment ago, we don't live in the ideal world. Those of us who make policy must live in the real world. And in the real world, there is only one nation on this planet still capable of rallying the free people of this world to the great causes of our time. And that nation is ours. That is not my opinion. That is a matter of fact that is stated to me every time that I travel abroad. In fact, the number one question I get when I was at the United Kingdom, or when I was in Japan, or Korea, or the Philippines, or anywhere else, the number one question I get is, will America still be engaged? Will they still be our partner, not just in our mutual defenses, but in our economic progress? Can we still count on American leadership? Or have you reached a point in your history where your people are no longer willing to do this? Because they're so focused on what's happening at home that they forget what's happening abroad impacts what's happening at home as well. In fact, that truism has never been more true. The world is more interconnected than it's ever been. Never before have we seen events halfway around the world have as much impact on things that are happening right here, right now. In fact, I would venture to guess that for many of you who are in business and commerce, events that are happening halfway around the world sometimes have a greater impact on your bottom line than events happening halfway across town. This is the world that we live in. And perhaps because I and many of you grew up in a generation that was raised after Vietnam, at the tail end of the Cold War, in a unipolar world where the United States was the only power on it, perhaps the temptation exists to grow complacent, to believe that all we have and all we see in the world we know today was simply the way things always were, that this is the normal and natural state of affairs. It's easy to believe that when you grow up in an era of unquestioned prosperity, in an era where democracy was growing, and there were few challenges to our leadership. But those who have been around longer, and those who have taken the time to study the true lessons of history, understand that that has never been the case, and it will not be the case now. Twice in the last century, this nation paid an extraordinary price for ignoring the events around us. And what happens with these problems around the world is they eventually come for us. There is no serious problem on this planet that will stay where it is. We can ignore our enemies, we can ignore our adversaries, we can ignore those who wish us ill, but I promise you they will not ignore us. In fact, I promise you that they aren't ignoring us right now. That there are nations on earth that we hardly talk about, whose number one priority is to diminish America's power and influence on the planet, and by consequence of that, diminish our way of life as well.